In the year 57 AD, if you just walked through the bustling, completely chaotic streets of Rome, you would be breathing air that was saturated with a sexual ethic that makes our modern culture look incredibly tame.
Oh, almost restrained by comparison, really.
Right. You're talking about an empire where 14 of the first 15 Roman emperors openly engaged in same-sex acts.
Yeah, 14 out of 15. It's staggering.
It wasn't some underground counterculture. It was the norm. It was celebrated in their art, it was defended in high philosophy, and completely institutionalized in the halls of power.
Exactly. It was just the water they were swimming in.
And into the very center of that, that imperial behemoth, a Jewish tent maker sent a letter that would just systematically dismantle their entire worldview. So welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
Today's deep dive is into perhaps the most intense, unvarnished diagnostic of the human condition that's ever been written. We're talking about Romans chapter 1, and we are specifically zeroing in on verses 26 and 27.
Yeah, and it is, well, it's the text that modern readers, I think, most want to avoid or, heavily edit.
Oh, absolutely.
The cultural friction here is just absolute. But to really understand it, whether you're a lifelong student of theology or you're just insanely curious about how these ancient texts shape our worldview today, we have to look past the modern debates. We have to examine what the Apostle Paul is actually constructing here.
Right, because this isn't just a list of moral grievances.
No, not at all. It is a profound, devastating argument about worship, the doctrine of creation, divine judgment, and the terrifying consequences of humanity basically formally refusing its creator.
And that is the exact mission for this deep dive, because if you miss the darkness of this diagnosis, the brilliance of the gospel, the cure that Paul eventually presents, it just loses all its miraculous power.
It really does. It falls flat.
Yeah. So we're going to unpack the history, the really precise Greek mechanics of Paul's argument, and how this ancient text creates this massive theological trap.
I love that word, trap, because to set the stage properly for that, we really have to immerse ourselves in the geography of where this letter was actually born. Paul didn't write Romans from some quiet, contemplative monastery.
Right. He was in Corinth.
He wrote it from Corinth.
Which is basically sitting in a city that was the commercial and cultic nerve center of the Mediterranean, right? Corinth was situated on this isthmus, which meant it controlled major trade routes.
Oh, yeah. Massive wealth flowed through there.
Famously wealthy, highly transient, and entirely devoted to a kind of rampant temple-fueled licentiousness. It was basically the Las Vegas of the ancient world.
That's a great way to put it. The reputation of Corinth in the ancient world, it cannot be overstated. It was so notorious that the Greeks actually coined a verb, Corinthiazomai.
Corinthiazomai.
Yeah, meaning to act like a Corinthian.
Wow.
And that was universal slang for committing gross sexual immorality. The city was overshadowed by the Acrocorinth, which was this massive temple dedicated to Aphrodite, and it housed, countless temple prostitutes.
So it's literally towering over him.
Exactly. So as Paul is physically writing this letter to the Romans, the ultimate physical and societal consequences of pagan idolatry are quite literally playing out outside his window. He is watching humanity operate at the absolute limits of its own autonomy.
And he's sending this letter to Rome, which is, it's essentially sending a theological declaration of war to the absolute center of military and cultural influence.
Oh, totally.
Because if Corinth was the chaotic market of vice, Rome was the sophisticated imperial institutionalization of it. Let's look at those emperors we mentioned. We have historical accounts of Tiberius retreating to the island of Capri and engaging in just horrific abuses of power and these jaded perversions.
It's dark stuff. And then you have Nero.
Oh, man, Nero.
Nero, who publicly castrated a young boy named Sporus, married him in an official ceremony with, a bridal veil and a dowry, treated him as an empress. And then later, Nero married a male freedman named Pythagoras. But this time, Nero acted as the bride himself.
It's just the elite normalization was absolute. It was everywhere.
It was. But it extended far beyond just the imperial palaces. You look at the classical literature of the time, Plato's Symposium, the writings of Aristophanes, Plutarch, practices like pederasty, which was the sexual relationship between adult male patrons and much younger boys. They were not just tolerated. They were culturally celebrated.
Like it was a mark of high society.
Yeah, they were viewed as this vehicle for noble philosophical education or elite military bonding. The Stoics and other pagan philosophers, they occasionally criticize certain forms of these acts, but usually only if they compromised Roman male dignity.
Right. For a Roman patrician, the only real sin was being penetrated.
Right.
Right, because that was associated with the subjugation of slaves and women.
Exactly. They almost never condemned the acts on the grounds of violating some transcendent divine moral law.
Okay, I have to push back here just to play devil's advocate for a second. Because if you're a first century Roman reading this, your definition of nature or natural, I think the Greek word is physis, is heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, right?
Physis.
So the Stoics believed that nature was just the rational order of the universe, or basically the established social hierarchy. So wouldn't a Roman patrician just argue that their sexual practices were completely natural to them because it fit their social order perfectly? How is Paul hijacking their own philosophical vocabulary there?
That is a brilliant distinction, actually. You've hit on the exact friction point of the whole passage. The Roman concept of physis was largely sociological and, philosophical.
Yeah.
It meant acting in accordance with your social status.
Right.
But Paul is a Hebrew of Hebrews. When he uses the concept of nature, he is not making a sociological argument at all. He is making a biological and theological one. He is entirely bypassing Greco-Roman philosophy and driving straight back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2.
The male and female creation order.
Precisely. Remember, Paul is writing to a church in Rome composed of both Jewish believers and Gentile converts. The Jewish believers already possess a worldview rooted in the Torah, including, the laws of Leviticus, which strictly forbade such acts based on the sanctity of the Creator's design.
So it's pulling from a very established tradition.
Exactly. Paul isn't inventing a new sexual ethic out of thin air just to shock the Romans. He is taking the established ancient biblical doctrine of creation, the idea that God designed humanity with binary complementary sexes to reflect his image, and he is holding it up like a mirror to the pagan darkness of Rome.
He's demonstrating that the polished, marble veneer of Greco-Roman civilization with all its brilliant architecture, the aqueducts, the philosophy, it's actually masking this rotting core of moral decay. And this is where it gets so fascinating. He isn't just doing this to play the cultural critic, is he?
No, not at all.
He's building a trap.
Yes. The architecture of the Book of Romans it's a masterpiece of rhetorical strategy.
Yeah.
You simply cannot isolate verses 26 and 27. They exist within a highly engineered, really tense space.
Yeah.
In chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul lays out his thesis. He is not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes.
Okay, the thesis is salvation.
Right. But before he can explain the salvation, he has to prove the absolute necessity of it. He has to prove universal guilt, which culminates later in chapter 3, verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
And to get from that gospel thesis to the conclusion of universal guilt, he builds this airtight prosecutorial case against the entire human race.
Yes, he acts like a prosecutor.
And he does it by outlining this terrifying sequence in chapter 1. The commentaries we're looking at call it the threefold exchange and the threefold abandonment. Walk us through how this symmetry works, because the repetition in the text, it feels incredibly deliberate, almost like a dark liturgy.
It is exactly like a dark liturgy. Paul outlines 3 distinct exchanges humanity makes. First, in verse 23, he writes that humanity exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for images resembling mortal man and animals.
So idolatry.
Yes, this is the foundational theological exchange. They traded the infinite creator for finite idols. Second, in verse 25, he reiterates that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worshiping and serving the creature rather than the creator.
And then the consequence of those first 2 exchanges triggers the third exchange, right? In verse 26, which is where we find the specific focus on human sexuality.
Correct. Because they exchanged God in theology, Paul says they exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones in biology. The literary correspondence is exact. As man treated God spiritually, so God allowed man to treat himself physically.
Wow.
The physical exchange is the visible, undeniable outward manifestation of the invisible spiritual rebellion.
And every time humanity forces one of these exchanges, there is a corresponding abandonment from God. Like 3 times in this chapter, Paul writes the phrase, God gave them over.
Yeah, chilling. In verse 24, God gives them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity. In verse 26, he gives them over to dishonorable passions. And then in verse 28, he gives them over to debased mind. This is God answering humanity's demand for total autonomy.
Okay, let's look at the trap itself. Because Paul lists all these visible pagan sins, right?
Yeah.
The idolatry, the sexual perversion, the greed, the murder, the deceit, the gossip. And if you are a morally upright reader in the first century, especially a Jewish Christian who has lived under the strict moral code of the Torah, you are reading the scroll and you are just nodding along.
Oh, you're loving it.
You are internally curing. Yes, Paul, give it to those degenerate Romans. They are under God's wrath. He lets their self-righteous indignation build to this absolute crescendo.
And then he turns the page. You really have to imagine the physical reading of this letter in a Roman house church.
Right, someone is reading it out loud to the room.
Exactly. The Jewish believers are feeling thoroughly vindicated. And then the reader hits chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things.
It is a breathtaking rhetorical ambush.
It is devastating. Paul uses the law to serve the gospel. He lets the moralist use the law to condemn the pagan, and that he uses that exact same law to condemn the moralist.
He's baiting the hook.
He is systematically shutting every single mouth in the room. The pagan Gentile is guilty because they violently rejected the Creator's design, which was evident in nature. The moralist Jew is guilty because they arrogantly judged the pagans while breaking the law themselves in other areas through covetousness, pride, hypocrisy, whatever it is.
It's as if Paul sets up an X-ray machine, points it at the pagans, lets the moralists marvel at how diseased the lungs look, and then flips the monitor to show the moralists that it was actually a live feed of their own chests.
That is a perfect analogy. The playing field is completely leveled. Total depravity is established.
Yeah.
Everyone, Jew and Gentile, sexually immoral and outwardly moral, stands completely empty-handed and condemned for a holy God.
And to fully grasp the severity of this trap and the really precise nature of the judgment Paul is describing, we have to put our English translations aside for a second and look at the microscopic nuances of the original Greek vocabulary. Because the sources point out that Paul does not waste a single syllable here.
No, his word choice is incredibly deliberate.
Let's start with that chilling phrase we just mentioned, God gave them over. The Greek word is paradokin. Now, this isn't just God sighing in disappointment, turning his back, and passively ignoring humanity, is it?
Not at all. Paradokin is a deeply judicial technical term. In Greek legal and military context, it is the exact word used for handing a convicted criminal over to the executioner, or handing a captive over to the prison guard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an active passive action.
So paradokin isn't God just passively taking his hands off the steering wheel. It's more like a demolition engineer deliberately removing the load-bearing pillars of a structurally compromised building. God isn't pushing the building over, he's actively removing the structural grace that was fighting gravity, allowing the natural weight of human rebellion to just crush the building in on itself.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. Theologians often refer to it as the removal of common grace. God actively withdraws his restraining hand. He opens the cage of human corruption and lets fallen humanity suffer the full, unmitigated tyranny of their own choices. The judgment is the abandonment.
And Paul specifies what God hands them over to. He says he gave them over to dishonorable passions. Now, earlier in chapter 1, Paul used a different word for lust, epithumia. But here he switches to the word pathos. What is the mechanical difference between those two concepts in the Greek mind?
That's a great catch. Epithumia generally refers to an act of desire, like a craving. It can be a strong lust, but it is something you actively do. Pathos, however, carries a much darker nuance. In this context, pathos denotes a passive, diseased, enslaved condition of the soul.
So it's the difference between, like, occasionally having a craving for a drink and being in the late stages of severe alcoholism where your body undergoes delirium tremens if you stop.
Exactly. It's not just a passing wish. It is an ontological state of being where uncontrollable, corrupted lusts spring forth involuntarily. It is literally an addiction of the soul. It's a state where your desires are no longer something you casually possess. They are something that possesses you. You are a captive to them.
Which makes the subsequent verses hit even harder. When Paul details the specific examples of these dishonorable passions in verses 26 and 27, dealing with female and male same-sex relations, he makes another highly unusual vocabulary choice. The sources point out he refuses to use the standard polite Greek words for men and women.
Right. Normally, a cultured Greek writer would use the word "anlorner" to describe a man and "gein" to describe a woman. Those are honorific terms.
Like gentleman and lady.
Yeah, they carry the weight of personal dignity, civic duty, social honor, and the sanctity of marriage. A Roman patrician prided himself on being an order.
But Paul deliberately strips those titles away. He uses the laei and orsons, which translate quite literally to the most base clinical terms, females and males. Why the linguistic demotion?
Because Paul is demonstrating the ultimate degrading trajectory of idolatry. By avoiding the honorific terms, he is showing how rebellion against the Creator reduces human beings from glorious image bearers to the level of raw, subhuman biology.
Ouch. That had to sting.
Oh, it's an incredible insult to Roman dignity. He's showing that when humanity rejects the divine dignity of God, it degrades itself to a brutish, animalistic state. He's looking at the most powerful, philosophically advanced men in the empire and essentially saying, your rebellion hasn't made you gods. It has reduced you to mere biological organisms acting out of sheer instinct.
And he categorizes these acts as being paraphysin, contrary to nature, which brings us back to that Stoic friction we talked about earlier. For Paul, nature is the established, created order of God in Genesis.
Yes.
So contrary to nature means violently rebelling against the Creator's anatomical, biological, and procreative design. It's the creature looking at how the manufacturer designed the equipment to function and deliberately overriding the system.
And the inevitable consequence of overriding the manufacturer's design, Paul writes, is that they receive in themselves the due penalty for their error. The Greek word here is antimistia.
Antimistia. That's a fascinating compound word. I know the commentary spent a lot of time on this one.
It really is. The prefix anti means in return for, corresponding to, and missos means wages or pay.
Like a paycheck.
Right. So antimistia means an inescapable self-executing penalty, a due recompense. It's the exact proportionate payback that corresponds perfectly to the crime.
It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's concept of hell being locked from the inside. The idea that God simply says to the rebel, "Thy will be done." The sin becomes its own built-in punishment.
Exactly.
Unrestrained desire is sold to us as ultimate freedom, but antimistia reveals it as absolute bondage. It's like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. The more you drink, the thirstier you get, and the biological act of drinking the salt is the exact mechanism that is actually destroying your kidneys and killing you.
And notice that Paul explicitly notes that they receive this penalty in themselves. The emotional despair, the spiritual deadness, the moral blindness, the fracture of human relationships, and the eventual physical breakdown. That is the antimistia. The judgment of God is not always fire from heaven. Most often, it is simply allowing the natural consequences of rebellion to run their devastating course in the human body and soul.
Wait, okay. If God's response is to hand them over to their own desires, the punishment itself is somewhat passive from God's side. That implies the original crime wasn't just a minor moral slip-up, but a fundamental cosmic breach of contract. What exactly did humanity do to warrant God actively removing his structural grace?
Well, this brings us to the theological core of Paul's argument. The root problem in Romans 1 is not actually sexual.
Really?
No, it is profoundly theological. It is the primal sin of idolatry.
Right. Disordered worship leads inevitably to disordered bodies. The text hinges on a specific transitional phrase for this reason, or diatuto in the Greek.
Diatuto, yes.
That phrase tightly chains the sexual disorder in verse 26 directly back to the spiritual treason in verse 25, exchanging the creator for the creature. So the sexual chaos is completely downstream from the worship chaos. When humanity rejects God's sovereign authority over the cosmos, they logically and inevitably reject his sovereign authority over their own bodies.
The logic is cold and unbreakable. If a human being stands before God and says, "You do not rule over the heavens and the earth. I am the captain of my own soul. I will worship whatever finite thing I choose," the very next sequential step in that rebellion is to say, "And you certainly do not rule over my physical body. I will do with it exactly what I want, regardless of how you designed it."
I have to ask the obvious question, though, because if you're listening to this right now, you're probably wondering the exact same thing I am. Why does Paul single out sexuality as the primary visceral evidence of this cosmic high treason?
It's a fair question.
If the root sin is idolatry, why not start with genocide, or massive greed, or the oppression of the poor? Why is same-sex relations the ultimate glaring litmus test for human rebellion in Paul's framework?
That is the pivotal question of Romans 1. And the answer requires us to look at the theology of the body. Idolatry, fundamentally, is the ultimate inversion of reality. It takes the pyramid of existence, where the infinite creator's at the top and the finite creature's at the bottom, and flips it completely upside down.
Putting the creature above the creator.
Yes. Now, how does that spiritual inversion manifest physically?
Hey.
God created humanity, male and female. That binary, complementary design was intentionally established to reflect his image, to foster unity and diversity, and to fulfill the mandate to be fruitful and multiply.
Right, the Genesis mandate.
When individuals abandon that complementary, outward-facing design for same-sex relations, it physically and biologically mimics the spiritual inversion of idolatry.
It's a biological mirror.
Exactly. It represents a creature turning away from the Creator's natural outward-facing design and turning inward, focusing entirely on a reflection of the self. The sameness of the relation mirrors the closed loop of idolatry, where humanity worships humanity instead of the transcendent other, which is God.
That makes so much sense.
So Paul places it here not just because it was a common Roman vice, but because it is the most vivid, physical, structural embodiment of the theological exchange. It isn't just a moral malfunction. It is a structural rejection of how God ordered the universe.
Which completely reframes how we view this text. It's not just a list of bad behaviors. It's a terrifying diagnosis of systemic, cosmic failure. And understanding the sheer weight of this rebellion, it helps us see the profound and actually highly unexpected impact this letter had on the people sitting in the Roman house churches hearing it read aloud.
We really have to reconstruct that room in our minds. The Roman Church was not meeting in grand cathedrals.
No, they were in living rooms.
They were huddled in the living rooms of whatever members had a house large enough to hold them. And the socioeconomic makeup of those believers was incredibly diverse. We've discussed how Paul's rhetoric was systematically crushing the intellectual pride of the Gentile elite and how it was setting a trap to humble the legalistic pride of the Jewish moralists.
Right.
But there's a third massive demographic in that room that we have to talk about.
The slaves.
The slaves and the freedmen.
The historical context here is utterly brutal. In the Roman Empire, a slave was not considered a human being under the law. They were classified as instrumentum vocale, a speaking tool.
A speaking tool. Just let that sink in.
It's horrific. A slave possessed absolutely zero legal rights over their own body. The paterfamilias, the male head of the Roman household, held the power of life and death and absolute sexual access to anyone beneath him in the social hierarchy.
And this access was exploited relentlessly. Roman masters routinely utilized male and female slaves for sexual pleasure, for the pederasty we discussed earlier, and for forced prostitution.
And there was no legal recourse.
None. While Rome had laws like the Lex Scantinia, which supposedly regulated sexual conduct, it only protected freeborn Roman citizens. Slaves were entirely unprotected. It was an inescapable daily horror for a vast portion of the lower classes, many of whom were finding their way into the early Christian church.
Let's stop and really process the visceral reality of this for a second. Imagine being a slave sitting in the back of that house church. You have endured horrific, mandatory sexual abuse at the hands of your pagan master. The entire society, the entire legal structure of the greatest empire on earth tells you that you are nothing.
You're just prop.
You exist solely as a vessel for a patrician's pleasure, and their abuse of you is considered totally natural, acceptable behavior.
And then the elder of the church unrolls the parchment from the Apostle Paul.
And Paul declares that the actions of your masters are not natural. They are a violent abomination to the creator of the universe. Paul declares that God is not blind to the abuses happening in the dark corners of the imperial villas. He declares that God is actively exacting a due penalty and anti-mistia on these powerful men.
The pastoral comfort of that moment must have been electric.
It completely upends the power dynamics.
It did. It elevated the moral and spiritual status of Christian slaves instantaneously. It validated their inherent dignity as image-bearers of God. It assured them that cosmic justice was real. Their abusers were not untouchable, enlightened elites who had the favor of the gods. They were condemned, debased rebels actively suffering under divine wrath.
Wow.
For the abused and the marginalized in that congregation, Paul's severe x-ray of human sin wasn't oppressive. It was a divine shield that defended their humanity against the worst abuses of the powerful.
That is a staggering historical insight. It completely flips the modern skeptical perception of this text. I mean, modern critics often claim this text is inherently oppressive, but in its original first-century context, it actively defended the most marginalized, traumatized people in the room against the predatory abuses of the powerful.
It really did. And yet, and this is the turn, it leaves us with a terrifying dilemma, because Paul doesn't let the abused slave merely gloat over the master's judgment. As we saw in chapter 2, and eventually in chapter 3, Paul proves that everyone in the room is a rebel in some capacity.
Right, the trap catches everyone.
The slave might not be guilty of the master's sins, but they are guilty of their own idolatry, their own hatred, their own deceit. The X-ray is terminal for every single human being.
If God's wrath is absolute and humanity's rebellion is universally total, How does anyone survive? I mean, the building is collapsing, the pillars are gone, and we are all inside.
This is exactly why you can never read Romans 1 in isolation. If you stop at Romans 1, you are left in the darkest nihilism imaginable. The diagnosis is fatal. But the darkness of the diagnosis is what makes the Christological remedy so blindingly brilliant. Romans 1 is the lock. Christ is the key.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that remedy, because how does Christ intercept this massive judicial abandonment? The theological commentaries we read draw a profound direct line between the perdokin, the giving over in chapter 1, and what physically and spiritually happens to Jesus of Nazareth on the cross. They use the term substitutionary abandonment.
It is the hinge upon which the entire Christian gospel turns. We established that in Romans 1, rebellious sinners are judicially given over, perdoken by God, to the terrifying consequences and wrath of their sin. They demand autonomy, and God abandons them to it.
Right.
But when we move to the gospel narratives and Paul's later explanations in Romans 4, we see an astonishing divine inversion.
The exact same Greek root word shows up.
Yes. Romans 4.25 says that Jesus was delivered up, perdoth, for our trespasses. God the Father judicially handed over his sinless, perfect Son to the executioner. On the cross, Jesus experienced the ultimate, concentrated judicial abandonment.
My God, my God.
Exactly. When darkness fell over Golgotha and Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was experiencing the ultimate perdoken.
He was experiencing the antimisthia, the exact due penalty for our cosmic treason.
Precisely. The abandonment that humanity earned by exchanging the Creator for the creature was entirely absorbed by Christ. He was abandoned by God so that the rebellious creature, through faith, would never have to be. He stood in the blast radius of divine wrath, shielding the guilty.
So the gospel isn't merely a moral self-help program. It doesn't just look at a person trapped in the addictions of pathos and say, hey, the x-ray looks bad. Try harder to modify your behavior. Just be better.
No, that'd be useless.
It provides a completely alien righteousness. It says you get a completely new identity that overrules your deepest, most profoundly disordered desires.
This is where Paul introduces Christ as the second Adam. Where the first Adam, representing all of humanity, rebelled and plunged the world into condemnation and disordered desire, Christ obeyed perfectly. He fulfilled all righteousness. And through union with Christ, a concept Paul explores deeply in Romans 6, the absolute dominion of sin over the human heart is definitively broken.
The theological distinction between definitive and progressive sanctification is crucial here. Let's make sure we clearly define how those two realities interact in the life of someone who is struggling with the exact sins listed in Romans 1.
Well, definitive sanctification is the reality that the very moment a person places their faith in Christ, the dictatorship of sin is overthrown, the chain is snapped. You are no longer a slave to pathos. You are definitively declared holy and righteous before God because of Christ's substitution.
But that doesn't mean the presence of the desire vanishes overnight.
Right, and that is progressive sanctification. The believer will still fight the presence and the lingering habits of sin for the rest of their earthly life. But the fundamental difference is that they are now fighting as a free person, not a slave.
They have new power.
They are empowered by the indwelling Holy Spirit to actively mortify, to put to death those lingering disordered desires. The desires may remain, they may flare up, but they no longer have the authority to rule.
And Paul provides living, breathing proof of this. We talked about Corinth earlier, the absolute epicenter of ancient hedonism. Paul writes a letter to the church located right there in that city, 1 Corinthians. And in chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, he lists out the specific people who make up that congregation. He lists former idolaters, adulterers, thieves, drunkards, and he explicitly uses the Greek terms for those who practiced homosexuality.
He names it all.
And then he delivers what has to be the most hopeful, defiant sentence in the entire New Testament.
And such were some of you.
And such were some of you. The past tense is everything there.
But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. The existence of the Corinthian church proved that no human being, no matter how deeply entrenched in the antimissia of Romans 1, is beyond the reach of God's sovereign grace.
It's beautiful.
The gospel explicitly rejects the idea that sexual sinners are uniquely beyond redemption. But it also explicitly rejects the idea that Christ simply accepts the sin and leaves the sinner in their bondage. Christ saves sinners from both the damning guilt and the ruling dominion of their sin.
It fundamentally restores a capacity for true worship. Because the initial crisis in Romans 1 was the exchange of the creator for the creature. Disordered worship produced dishonored bodies. But Paul brings the entire theological argument full circle when he reaches Romans 12, verse 1.
He does. He writes, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship.
The physical body, which was previously degraded and dishonored through the rebellion of Romans 1, is now redeemed, cleansed, and presented back to God as a holy instrument. The body matters.
It reclaims the body for its original glorious purpose. The core confession of the Christian is no longer the pagan demand for autonomy. The confession is, my body is not my own, it belongs to Christ, because Christ purchased it with his own blood.
Which brings us to the sharpest edge of this text. Because this theology is not just an ancient artifact to be studied in a museum, it makes absolute, totalizing demands on how the modern church and individual believers must think, act, and live today. The friction between Romans 1 and the 21st century is arguably hotter now than it has been in hundreds of years.
The collision is unavoidable. Modern Western culture is built almost entirely on the premise of bodily autonomy and the sovereign authority of internal desire. The cultural narrative dictates that the intensity of a desire equals its authenticity. If you feel an attraction or an impulse strongly, it must represent your true self.
Right, and to deny that impulse is to deny your core humanity.
Exactly. The ultimate modern sin is suppressing your own desires.
But the theological framework of Romans 1 shatters that premise entirely. It argues that because of the historic fall of humanity, human desires are fundamentally corrupted. Desire is not self-authenticating. It is not morally neutral. The Christian worldview insists that deeply felt desires can actually be the manifestation of pathos-diseased, enslaved passions.
Which means our desires cannot be the compass by which we navigate reality. They must be evaluated against the objective standard of God's created order. If a desire conflicts with the Creator's design, it must be starved, repented of, and mortified, regardless of how intense or natural it feels to the fallen mind.
And the sources we're studying point out that this text specifically creates massive friction with several modern theological and sociological movements. Like, let's look at what is commonly called Side B theology.
Right, Side B.
For those familiar with the debate, Side B generally concedes that while homosexual acts are prohibited by Scripture, a homosexual orientation, the persistent internal attraction, is merely a benign, fallen reality. It's often argued that a person can embrace gay Christian as a valid identity, provided they commit to lifelong celibacy. But according to the commentaries, how does the precise Greek of Romans 1 short-circuit that framework?
Well, according to the sources, it short-circuits it by focusing on the culpability of the internal desire itself. Side B theology attempts to separate the internal orientation from the external act, declaring the orientation non-sinful. But remember Paul's use of the word pathos.
The diseased passion?
Exactly. He explicitly condemns the internal subjective inclination. He describes these men as being consumed with passion for one another.
So the passion itself is the judgment.
Yes. The theological argument presented in these commentaries is that the internal desire to act contrary to God's creation is itself part of the divine judgment and moral depravity. The root of the desire is inherently corrupted by idolatry, even if the person exercises immense willpower and never commits the physical act.
So it can't be baptized into an identity.
Right. Therefore, the desire cannot be embraced or integrated into a Christian identity. It remains an alien, sinful impulse that must be actively repented of. You cannot make peace with the pathos.
And what makes this text so universally disruptive is that it doesn't just challenge modern sexual ethics. The sources note it also completely dismantles modern sociological frameworks, like critical race theory or various forms of intersectionality.
Yeah, that's a fascinating application.
These frameworks rely heavily on categorizing humanity into rigid binaries of oppressed classes versus oppressor classes, often integrating sexual orientation into the matrix of oppression.
And Romans 1 entirely rejects the oppressor-oppressed binary as the fundamental lens for viewing humanity. It flattens the sociological hierarchy. It argues that practicing these acts or harboring these desires does not place an individual into a special oppressed class that is owed societal restitution.
Instead, it identifies them as part of the universal rebellion against a holy God.
Exactly. The true binary in Scripture is not oppressor versus oppressed. It is holy creator versus rebellious creature. And the only resolution to that conflict is not political revolution, but personal repentance and desperate reliance on divine grace, which is offered equally to all.
And it even challenges classical theological systems within the church itself. If we look at Arminianism, which strongly emphasizes that fallen humanity retains a free will capable of independently choosing to follow God, Romans 1 seems to aggressively close the door on that kind of human ability, according to our Reformed sources.
It does. The terrifying repetition of God gave them over demonstrates that human will is not neutral or free. When God removes his restraining grace, humanity does not naturally drift toward righteousness. It plunges headlong into severe bondage.
Total depravity.
Yes, the sinner is totally enslaved to their own corrupt passions. They cannot free themselves. It is a profound proof text for the Reformed understanding of total depravity, that every faculty of the human person is corrupted by sin, rendering them completely incapable of saving themselves apart from God's sovereign, regenerating, electing grace, acting first.
Which leaves us with a critical, incredibly sobering application for the church today. If we accept the authority of Paul's argument, it completely destroys any attempt to create an informal, comfortable hierarchy of sins.
Oh, absolutely.
We cannot sit comfortably in our pews, point our fingers at the pagan culture outside the doors, and loudly condemn sexual immorality while quietly tolerating the greed, the malicious gossip, the pride, the unjust divorces, and the heterosexual lust festering inside the church.
To do so is to walk directly into the jaws of the trap Paul set in Romans 2. Selective outrage is the height of theological hypocrisy. If a congregation preaches fiercely against Romans 1.26, but ignores the deceit and covetousness listed in Romans 1.29, they are acting precisely like the self-righteous moralists who fall under God's condemnation.
It's a double standard.
The presence of any persistent, unrepentant sin in our lives should instantly strip away our pride.
It should drive us to our knees. It should drive us to utilize the ordinary means of grace devouring the scriptures, earnest prayer, genuine Christian fellowship, submitting to church discipline, rather than endlessly comparing ourselves to the secular world just to feel a fleeting sense of moral superiority.
The proper biblical response to reading Romans 1 is never to stand up and say, look at how wicked those people are. The only proper response is to strike your chest and say, look at the horrifying capability of my own heart. Look at my own inherent rebellion against the Creator. And thank God for the substitutionary death of Jesus Christ, because without it, I am utterly lost.
That is the ultimate takeaway. We have covered massive, heavy ground today. We started in the neon-lit, idol-saturated streets of ancient Corinth. We looked at the terrifying X-ray of human rebellion where humanity exchanged the infinite glory of God for the cheap, finite lie.
A dark journey.
Yeah, we saw how disordered worship inexorably leads to disordered bodies, and how God's wrath is revealed in the active, judicial abandonment of humanity to its own destructive autonomy.
We also traced Paul's brilliant logic out of that darkness, straight to the cross. We saw Christ absorbing the full weight of the antimistia, breaking the iron dominion of pathos, and offering a new, blood-bought identity to the worst of sinners.
This text is a mirror. It forces us to confront our own native tendency to commit cosmic treason, but it also points us to the only cure. And as we wrap up this deep dive, where do we go from here? We are still living in fallen bodies in a fallen world, fighting these lingering corrupted desires.
Well, if I could leave you with a final thought, we have to look ahead to the eschatological horizon of this exact same letter. We've spent this time at Romans 1, which vividly describes a creation violently disordered and fractured by human rebellion. But if you keep reading Paul's argument, you eventually arrive at the great crescendo of Romans chapter 8.
The promise of future glory.
Exactly. In Romans 8, Paul writes that all of creation is currently groaning under the bondage of corruption. But he promises that a day is coming when creation itself will be liberated. We, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies.
That's our hope.
The ultimate Christian answer to our disordered desires is not merely white-knuckling our way through life, surviving temptation through sheer willpower. It is the absolute certainty of the future resurrection.
The total restoration.
There is a day approaching, rapidly, where your physical body and your deepest, most profound desires will be flawlessly, perfectly, eternally aligned with the Creator's original design. The internal war will cease. The pathos will be eradicated forever. There will be no more shame, no more corruption, no more fractured identity, just a perfect, joyful conformity to the image of Christ. I want to challenge everyone listening to spend time today thinking about what that kind of absolute cosmic restoration will actually feel like.
What a magnificent thought to end on. The diagnosis is darker than we ever dared to admit, but the great physician has provided a cure that is infinitely more powerful than we could ever imagine. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep wrestling with the text, Keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.